I have been asked to begin with the contact. The contact was logged at 0611 station time, OSIC approach marker 7, bearing 241 relative to the Inquisition Fleet's forward screen. I was at the primary scan array. That is my posting. Senior Scan Analyst, Vashari Inquisition Fleet, Third Cataloguing Arm. I have held the posting for 11 years. I am telling you this because the board has asked about my qualifications, and because what happened next was not a product of inexperience. The hull appeared on passive telemetry at a range of approximately 4,000 kilometers. Single contact. Speed, 0.003 standard, which is low commercial transit velocity. Mass return, approximately 280,000 tons, which places the hull in the light carrier or heavy freighter bracket. Hull geometry on passive was consistent with a blunt-nose transit design. Wide cargo amidships, narrow drive section aft. No emissions consistent with weapons charge. No active arrays lit. No military drive signature. I pulled the archive entry while the passive return was still settling. The entry was clear. Human registry designation, veterans due. Commission date, 43 years prior. Class, Pathan Pattern Light Supply Runner. Armament listed in archive, none. Threat rating assigned by the Third Cataloguing Arm on prior contact, 18 years ago, negligible. The archive entry was 4 lines. 4 lines for a 280,000-ton hull in a contested transit corridor, because there was nothing to say about it. It was a supply runner. It had been a supply runner for 43 years. The archive said so. Fleet Commander Osselvaran asked me for a classification. I gave him one. Hull type, commercial transit, light supply class. Threat level, negligible, consistent with prior cataloging. I recommended standard doctrine. Standard doctrine in the Vashari Inquisition Fleet, for any hull in a contested approach corridor, is active deep scan pulse. You do not accept passive telemetry as a final classification. You do not accept archive entries without verification. You do not leave a hull unscanned in Inquisition space. That is the doctrine. That is what the doctrine is for. We classify everything. We know everything we face before we engage it. That is what has made the Third Cataloguing Arm the most effective force in the OSIC region for 60 years. I initiated the deep scan pulse at 0614. The return took 11 seconds. A standard deep scan return on a hull of that mass takes between 8 and 14 seconds. 11 seconds was within normal range. I did not note any irregularity in the return time. I will tell the board that clearly, the timing was not anomalous. The pulse propagated cleanly. The hull responded to the pulse the way a hull responds to a pulse. It reflected the carrier wave, and the carrier wave came back, and the array assembled the return data the way it always assembles return data. There was nothing in the propagation or the reflection that suggested the pulse had done anything other than travel to the hull and return. The data was anomalous. The scan return showed weapons arrays. Not the absence of weapons arrays. Not an empty bay or a decommissioned mount. Active weapons arrays. The count I logged in my initial reading was 44 discrete installation points, distributed across the dorsal and ventral hull surface in a pattern I did not recognize from any archive entry in the Third Cataloguing Arm's catalog. The power readings associated with those installations exceeded the maximum entry in our reference scale by a factor the system flagged as a calibration error. I believed it was a calibration error. That is in the log. I noted it as a probable calibration error and ran the scan again. I want the board to understand what I mean when I say I believed it was a calibration error. The veterans due was a supply runner. It had been scanned once before, 18 years ago, and the return had been clean. A hull of that class and age does not carry weapons installations of that count, at that power level, in a configuration that does not appear in any archive this fleet has ever compiled. The most reasonable explanation for a return of that kind is instrument error. I am a senior scan analyst with 11 years at the array. Instrument error is part of my job to recognize and correct. I ran the scan again. The second pulse went out at 0614 plus 31 seconds. I want to be precise about the sequence of events that followed the second pulse, because the board's questions have suggested some confusion about the order. The second pulse return began arriving at 0614 plus 42 seconds. At 0614 plus 44 seconds, 11 seconds before the second return was complete, hull impact alarms activated on 19 Inquisition vessels simultaneously. I am reading those times from the log because I did not experience them as a sequence at the time. I experienced them as a single event. The alarms and the incomplete return and the whole contact reports from 19 vessel commanders arrived in my awareness as one undifferentiated moment that I did not have the architecture to process. The second return confirmed the first. 44 weapons installations. Power readings beyond scale. Configuration unrecognized. 19 hulls had already been struck. I need the board to understand what the veterans due did during this interval. I have reviewed the visual records. The hull maintained course and speed throughout. 0.003 standard.
No deviación.
It did not maneuver, did not alter its drive output, did not turn toward the fleet. The weapons discharge, 44 simultaneous strikes at ranges between 800 and 3,200 kilometers, distributed across 19 targets with apparent individual targeting solutions, was completed before the hull made any observable change in behavior. There was no arming sequence that our instruments detected. There was no targeting sweep. There was no hail. The discharge was simply complete, and then the hull continued on its course. Fleet Commander Osselvarin ordered the fleet to hold transmissions at 0615 plus 9 seconds. I want to note for the board's record that the order was correct, well-timed, and precisely what doctrine requires when contact parameters exceed catalog bounds. He had 11 seconds of data when he issued it. The order reached the array at 0615 plus 11 seconds. 47 pulses had been transmitted by that point. The Inquisition Fleet's doctrine is not executed from a single array. The standard deep scan protocol for a contested approach contact activates all available scan installations simultaneously. 47 vessels each carry a primary scan array. Standard doctrine in a contact situation is for all 47 arrays to pulse in coordinated sequence, overlapping returns, cross-reference data, the most complete picture achievable. That is why the returns are reliable. That is why the data is accurate. That is why the Third Cataloguing Arm has the classification record it has. Every hull pulses. Every hull gets a return. The picture is complete. 47 pulses. 47 returns, each one confirming the same weapon installation count, the same power readings, the same unrecognized configuration. I do not know what the weapon aboard the veterans due is key to. I am not in a position to tell the board what the targeting architecture looks like from the inside of that hull. What I can tell the board is what it appeared to be from the outside. Each deep scan pulse, on contact with the hull, produced a targeting solution. One pulse, one solution. 47 pulses, 47 solutions. The discharge did not occur in sequence. It was not a volley. It was more accurate to say that the veterans due was already finished before the first impact alarm sounded on the first struck hull, that the 47 solutions were calculated and resolved at a speed our instruments registered as simultaneous, or near enough that the distinction is without operational meaning. 29 Inquisition hulls were struck. Of those, 11 were destroyed outright. 14 suffered drive or structural failure and were unable to maintain station. 4 took strikes to non-critical systems and remained operable. I am giving the board these numbers from the damage log, not from my recollection, because in the minutes following the discharge I was not compiling statistics. I was looking at the return data from the second scan pulse, which had finished arriving during the impact interval, and I was reading the weapons installation count again. 44. The same number. Unchanged. The veterans due had discharged 47 targeting solutions simultaneously and the weapons installation count in the return data had not changed. I did not have a framework for that. I still do not have a framework for that. Fleet Commander Osselvarin was aboard one of the 14 hulls with drive failure. Command passed to Secondary Commander Brettis Kale on the hull OSSEC patience. Brettis Kale issued 3 orders in the following 4 minutes. Stand off to maximum range, transmit nothing, and do not, under any circumstance, initiate any scan pulse of any kind. Those orders are in the log. They are correct orders. I am not suggesting otherwise. I am noting them for the board's record because I think the board should understand that by 0619, the senior surviving officer of the Vashari Inquisition Fleet's Third Cataloguing Arm had already reached the same conclusion I had reached, which was that the weapon was the pulse, and the pulse was the weapon, and the only defense available to us was silence. 18 hulls held station at maximum range. We transmitted nothing. We did not scan. The veterans due maintained course and speed. 0.003 standard. Bearing unchanged. It did not alter its heading toward the surviving hulls. It did not hail. It did not slow. It moved through the OSSEC approach on the same vector it had been following when passive telemetry first logged it, and it continued on that vector, and at 0731 it passed beyond passive telemetry range and was gone. I watched it go. I have been asked whether I recognize the weapon's design from any prior contact record, any archived engagement report, any intelligence summary compiled by any Inquisition fleet operating in any approach corridor this fleet has records for. The answer is no. I have reviewed every relevant entry in the Third Cataloguing Arms archive in the weeks since the OSSEC contact. I have not found a record of a scan-keyed targeting architecture of this kind on any human hull of any class, registered or unregistered, archived or observed. The weapon does not appear in the catalogue. I have been asked what that absence means. I will tell the board what I believe it means, and the board can weigh that against whatever else it has received. The weapon is not absent from the catalogue because we failed to find it. The weapon is absent from the catalogue because the Veterans Due was never scanned by a fleet that survived to file a return. A hull that carries a scan-keyed targeting system will not produce a clean archive entry. It will produce a destroyed scanning fleet. The archive entry will remain 4 lines. Negligible. Light supply runner. No armament listed. The archive will say so because every fleet that has ever found out otherwise is not in a position to update it. I do not know how many hulls carry that classification. I do not know how many supply runners, or light freighters, or decommissioned patrol craft, or commercial transit vessels are moving through contested corridors right now at 0.003 standard with 4-line archive entries and weapons installation counts that no surviving fleet has ever managed to write down. The Veterans Due is 43 years old. I do not know when those installations were made. I do not know who made them, or what the contract said, or what other human hulls received the same treatment in the same yard in the same year or the years after. The archive does not tell me, because the archive only contains what surveying fleets reported, and surveying fleets that scan those hulls do not report back. I do not know how many 4-line archive entries exist in the Third Cataloguing Arms records, or in the records of any other Vashari fleet, that were written by a prior cataloguing contact and never revised because the hull that tried to revise them was destroyed in the attempt. I am not able to calculate that number. I do not think I want to. The board has asked me what I would have done differently. I have considered this question for several weeks. I have reviewed the log at each decision point. I have considered whether there was a choice available to me at 0614 that would have produced a different outcome. The hull was in the OSSEC approach. Standard doctrine requires active deep scan classification of all hulls in a contested corridor. I am a senior scan analyst. Initiating the classification pulse is my posting. The archive entry said negligible. The archive entry was consistent with prior contact. I followed the doctrine. The doctrine is correct. The doctrine is what the Third Cataloguing Arm is built on. You do not leave a hull unscanned. You classify everything. You know what you face before you engage it. I would have done the same thing. That is what I would have told the board, if the board had asked me that question before 0614 on the day of the OSSEC contact. I would have said, I would follow the doctrine, because the doctrine is correct, and a fleet that does not scan is a fleet that is blind, and a fleet that is blind is a fleet that loses. I do not know what to say to the board now. I have thought about this since 0731, when the Veterans Due left passive telemetry range and the approach went quiet. I have thought about what it means that the doctrine is the mechanism. The Third Cataloguing Arm is the most thorough scanning force in this region precisely because every hull pulses, and the returns are cross-referenced, and the picture is complete. 47 arrays. 47 pulses. A complete picture. That is what the Veterans Due required. It did not need us to be careless, or aggressive, or trigger-happy. It needed us to be exactly what we are. It needed us to do our job. The Veterans Due knows what the doctrine is. It has always known. And it drifts through the approaches at 0.003 standard, logged in every archive as negligible, waiting for a scanning fleet to do exactly what a scanning fleet does. I have nothing further.